Do you ever wonder what it would be like? Lucas's voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. His eyes held mine, dark and unreadable, as he stepped closer. To feel something real again? I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt too small, the air too thick, and every fiber of my being screamed that I should step back, that I should put distance between us. But I didn't. I couldn't. His presence was magnetic, pulling me in, and I was helpless to resist. "Lucas," I started, my voice trembling. "I can't." "Can't what?" he interrupted, his tone challenging but soft, almost tender. "Can't admit that you feel it too? That this," he gestured between us, "isn't just in your head?" I opened my mouth to deny it, to defend the life I'd built with Julian, the vows I'd taken, the loyalty I owed him. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I knew he was right. The connection between us was undeniable, electric, and it had been growing since the moment Julian brought him home. It started innocently enough. Julian had mentioned that a new employee was joining his team at the architecture firm, someone young and ambitious, someone who reminded him of himself when he was starting out. "You'll like him," Julian had said over dinner one night, his tone casual. "He's got this charm about him. You know, the kind that makes people feel at ease." I nodded, uninterested, focused more on the grilled salmon on my plate than the details of Julian's work life. It wasn't until Lucas showed up at our door that I realized how wrong I'd been to dismiss him. The moment I opened the door, I felt it, a jolt, like the air around us had shifted. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a confident stance, but it was his smile that caught me off guard. Bright, genuine, with a warmth that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. His skin was deep and rich, like polished mahogany, and his eyes, God, his eyes were something else. Dark, intense, and somehow gentle all at once. "You must be Ava," he said, extending a hand. His voice was smooth, with a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. "Julian's told me so much about you." I shook his hand, feeling a strange flutter in my chest as our fingers touched. "All good things, I hope?" He chuckled, a low, velvety sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Only the best." I invited him in, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened as he followed me into the living room. Julian was in the kitchen, pouring drinks, oblivious to the tension that had already begun to simmer between me and his new colleague. "So, Lucas," I said, forcing myself to sound casual, "how are you finding the city so far?" "It's been an adjustment," he admitted, sitting down on the couch with an ease that suggested he was no stranger to making himself at home. "But I'm starting to find my way, and meeting people like Julian and you, of course, has made it easier." There was something about the way he looked at me when he said that, something that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being polite, but deep down I knew better. Over the next few weeks, Lucas became a regular presence in our lives. He joined us for dinners, movie nights, even a weekend trip to the lake house. And with each interaction, the tension between us grew, simmering just beneath the surface. It started with small things, a lingering glance, a brush of hands as I passed him a cup of coffee, a conversation that lasted long after Julian had gone to bed. We talked about everything, our childhoods, our dreams, our fears. And with each word, I felt myself being drawn deeper into his orbit, unable to resist the pull of his magnetic personality. I tried to ignore it, to focus on Julian, on the life we'd built together. But it was hard when every moment with Lucas felt like a spark, igniting something inside me that I thought had long since burned out. "Ava," Lucas said again, his voice pulling me back to the present. He was closer now, so close I could feel the heat radiating off his body. "You don't have to say anything. I can see it in your eyes." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This is wrong. This is so wrong. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I couldn't bring myself to move away. Because for the first time in years, I felt alive. Truly, burningly alive. I started, but before I could finish, his hand was on my cheek, his touch so gentle it made my breath catch. "It's okay," he murmured, his lips brushing against my ear. "You don't have to fight it." And then, before I could think, before I could stop him, his lips were on mine, soft and insistent, igniting a fire that I didn't know I was capable of feeling. My hands found their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer, and for a moment, the world fell away. But just as quickly as it began, I pulled back, panic rising in my chest. "Lucas, we can't." "Can't what?" he interrupted, his voice low and intense. "Can't admit that this is exactly what we both need? Can't admit that you've been waiting for someone to make you feel this way again?" I stared at him, my heart pounding, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He was right. God, he was so right. But that didn't make it any less terrifying. And then, before I could respond, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment, and I felt my blood run cold as Julian's voice called out from the hallway. "Ava? Lucas? You guys in?" I froze, my breath hitching in my chest as Julian's footsteps echoed closer. Lucas stepped back, his eyes locking with mine for a split second, a silent acknowledgement passing between us before he turned to face the doorway. My heart was a frantic drumbeat in my ears, and I could feel the heat of shame creeping up my neck. "Hey, guys," Julian said as he rounded the corner, his usual easy smile in place. He was carrying a couple of grocery bags, oblivious to the tension that still hung thick in the air. "I thought I'd grab some stuff for dinner. Figured it's been a while since we've all had a proper meal together." I forced a smile, my hands trembling as I took one of the bags from him. "That's sweet of you, Julian." "Thanks." Lucas nodded, his tone casual, almost too casual. "Sounds great. Need any help in the kitchen?" Julian chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, I've got it. You two just relax. Ava, you've been running around all day. Sit down for a bit." I hesitated, my gaze flickering to Lucas for the briefest moment before I nodded. "All right. Thanks." I retreated to the living room, sinking into the couch, my mind still reeling. My heart was racing, and I could still feel the ghost of Lucas's touch on my skin, his words ringing in my ears. "You've been waiting for someone to make you feel this way again." He wasn't wrong, and that was the most terrifying part. The sound of Julian humming in the kitchen was almost comforting in its normalcy, but it only amplified the guilt clawing at my chest. How could I sit here, pretending everything was fine, when I was so acutely aware of the storm brewing inside me? Lucas lingered in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, his eyes on me. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze that made my stomach twist, a mixture of desire and something else I couldn't quite place. Resolve? Regret? I looked away, focusing on the hem of my shirt, twisting it between my fingers. "Ava," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." I glanced up, my heart skipping a beat. "Not now," I mouthed, gesturing subtly toward the kitchen where Julian was still puttering around. Lucas's jaw tightened, but he nodded, pushing off the doorway and disappearing down the hall. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders sagging with relief, but the reprieve was short-lived. I knew this wasn't over. There was no going back now. Dinner was a quiet affair, the clink of silverware against plates the only sound that filled the space. Julian's attempts at conversation were met with half-hearted responses, and I could feel Lucas's gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. I avoided his eyes, focusing instead on the food in front of me, though I barely tasted a bite. "Everything all right, Ava?" Julian asked, concern furrowing his brow. "You've been quiet." I forced a smile, nodding. "Just tired, I guess. It's been a long day." He reached across the table, squeezing my hand gently. "Well, maybe it's time for an early night. You've been working too hard lately." I nodded again, grateful for the excuse to retreat. "Yeah, maybe you're right." As I stood to clear the table, Lucas stood as well, his hand brushing mine as he took my plate. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, my breath catching in my throat. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw the same turmoil reflected in his gaze. "I've got this," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of tension. "You should rest." I hesitated, then nodded, stepping back. Thanks. I retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind me and leaning against it, my heart pounding. I could hear the muted sounds of Julian and Lucas in the kitchen, their voices low and indistinct. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to steady my breathing. What was I doing? How had I let this happen? I loved Julian. He was my husband, the man I'd built a life with. But the truth was, I hadn't felt this alive in years. Lucas had awakened something in me, something I thought I'd buried long ago. And now I didn't know how to turn it off. The door creaked open, and I turned to see Julian stepping inside, his expression soft with concern.
"Hey," he said gently.
"You sure you're okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile. Just a lot on my mind, I guess. He crossed the room, pulling me into his arms, and I rested my head against his chest, the familiar scent of him enveloping me. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it threatened to choke me. But I also felt safe here, in his embrace. Safe, but something was missing. "You know you can talk to me, right?" he murmured, his hand rubbing soothing circles on my back. "About anything." I closed my eyes, swallowing hard. "I know. Thank you, Julian." He kissed the top of my head, his touch gentle, and for a moment, I almost believed everything would be okay. But then, as I pulled away, I caught a glimpse of movement in the doorway. Lucas was standing there, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark with something I couldn't name. Our gazes locked, and time seemed to stand still. My pulse quickened, my breath catching in my throat as I saw the hunger in his eyes, the same hunger that was mirrored in my own. And in that moment I knew, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Julian turned, noticing Lucas in the doorway, and smiled.
"Hey, man.
"Everything good?" Lucas nodded, his voice calm, but his eyes still on me.
Yeah.
"Just checking in." "Good night, Ava." "Good night," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He lingered for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared down the hall. Julian closed the door, oblivious to the storm that had just passed between us, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. As we climbed into bed, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Julian's breathing soon evened out, the steady rhythm of his sleep a stark contrast to the chaos in my head. I thought about Lucas, about the way he made me feel, and I knew I was in deep. But I also knew I couldn't keep living like this, torn between two men, between duty and desire. I had to make a choice. But how? The next morning, I woke up to Julian's side of the bed empty, the sheets cool to the touch. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced at the clock. It was already past 9. I hadn't slept this late in years. Where is he? I thought, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. The house was quiet, too quiet, and a strange sense of unease settled over me as I padded downstairs. In the kitchen, I found a note on the counter. "Gone to work early. Left coffee in the pot for you. Love you. Julian." I stared at the note, the words swimming in front of my eyes. Love you. It felt like a lifetime since he'd said those words to me, and yet they didn't feel like enough anymore. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the bitter aroma doing little to soothe my restless mind. I was still standing there, lost in thought, when the doorbell rang. My heart leapt into my throat. Lucas. It had to be him. I glanced down at myself, suddenly aware of how I must look, my hair a mess, my robe barely tied. I hesitated, but the doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. I opened the door to find Lucas standing there, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. He was dressed casually, a black jacket slung over his shoulders, but he looked as striking as ever. How does he do that? I thought, feeling both drawn and unnerved by his presence. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and smooth. "Good morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here?" He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "I wanted to see you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the edge of the door. "Julian's not here," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I know, Lucas said, his lips curving into a slow, knowing smile. That's why I came. My heart pounded in my chest, the air between us crackling with tension. I knew I should close the door. I knew I should tell him to leave. But I couldn't. Instead, I stepped aside, letting him in. The moment the door closed behind him, I felt the weight of what I'd just done settle over me. Lucas moved through the house with an ease that made it seem like he belonged there. He took a seat at the kitchen table, his eyes following me as I busied myself with the coffee pot. You don't have to pretend with me, Ava, he said, his voice soft but insistent. I turned to face him, my hands trembling slightly. What are you talking about? He leaned forward, his gaze intense. You're not happy. I can see it in your eyes. You're trying to hold it all together, but you're drowning. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the walls I'd built around myself begin to crumble. You don't know anything about me, I said, my voice shaking. Don't I? He countered, his voice calm but firm. I've seen the way you look at me. I've felt the way you respond when I'm near you. You can't hide it, Ava. Not from me. I felt a flush of heat rise to my cheeks, my body betraying me even as my mind screamed to pull away. This is wrong, I whispered, more to myself than to him. Lucas stood up, closing the distance between us in a few quick strides. He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek, the touch sending a shiver down my spine. Sometimes, what feels wrong is exactly what you need, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the words refused to come. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, my body betraying my carefully constructed defenses. What are you doing? A voice in the back of my mind screamed.
Stop this. Now.
But I couldn't. Not when he looked at me like that. Not when his touch sent waves of warmth through me that I hadn't felt in years. Lucas leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear. Let me show you what it feels like to be alive again, he murmured, his breath hot against my skin. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I was crossing a line I could never come back from. But in that moment, I didn't care. All I could think about was the way he made me feel, the way he made me forget about everything else. When his lips met mine, it was like a spark igniting a fire that had been smoldering inside me for far too long. His kiss was slow and deliberate, each movement sending shivers of pleasure through me. I felt myself responding, my body moving to his as if it had a mind of its own. This is it, I thought, my mind hazy with desire. This is what I've been missing. But then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Lucas pulled away, his eyes searching mine. Tell me you want this, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. My mind was a whirlwind of guilt and desire, each emotion warring for dominance. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped me out of my daze. My heart leapt into my throat as I pulled away from Lucas, my eyes wide with panic. Julian, I whispered, the name feeling like a knife to my chest. Lucas stepped back, his expression unreadable. I'll go out the back, he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. I nodded, my hands trembling as I smoothed down my robe. Please, I said, the word barely audible. He gave me one last lingering look before turning and disappearing through the kitchen door. I stood there, my heart racing, as the front door opened.
Ava.
Julian's voice called out, his usual warmth tinged with concern. Are you home? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. In the kitchen, I called back, my voice steadier than I felt. Julian appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed as he took in my disheveled appearance. Are you okay? He asked, stepping closer. I forced a smile, my mind racing to come up with an explanation. Just didn't sleep well last night, I said, hoping he wouldn't press further. He reached out, his big, reassuring hand brushing against my arm. You know you can talk to me, right? He said, his eyes filled with genuine concern. My heart ached at his words, the guilt threatening to consume me. I know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Good, he said, giving me a warm smile. Because I'm here for you, Ava. Always. I felt a lump form in my throat, the weight of his words crushing me. Always. The word felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of everything I was risking. But before I could say anything, Julian leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead. I love you, he murmured, the words sending a fresh wave of guilt through me. I love you too, I whispered, the words feeling hollow on my lips. Julian pulled away, his easy smile back in place. I'm going to grab a shower, he said, already heading for the stairs. Don't work too hard today, okay? I nodded, watching him disappear up the stairs. The moment he was out of sight, I sank into a chair, my legs giving out beneath me. What have I done? I thought, my mind spinning with the weight of my choices. But even as the guilt threatened to consume me, I couldn't help but think about Lucas, about the way he made me feel, the way he made me forget about everything else. I had to make a choice. But how? The sound of the shower running upstairs snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the back door, my heart racing as I considered my options. Ava, Lucas's voice called out, soft but insistent. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his dark eyes filled with a mix of longing and determination. You have to decide, he said, his voice low and urgent. You can't keep living like this. I felt my breath catch, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I know, I whispered, my voice trembling. So, what's it going to be? He asked, stepping closer. Him or me? His question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and unrelenting. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. Lucas stood there, his presence filling the space between us, demanding an answer I wasn't ready to give. I don't know, I stammered finally, my voice barely audible. My hands twisted in the fabric of my skirt, nerves threatening to unravel me. Lucas stepped closer, his dark eyes locked onto mine. You can't keep pretending, Ava. You feel it just as much as I do. I see it in the way you look at me, the way you pull away, but always come back. His voice was low, almost a growl, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of conflicting emotions. It's not that simple, Lucas. Julian, he's my husband. I made a commitment to him. And what about the commitment to yourself? He shot back, his tone sharp. You can't keep burying who you are, what you want. Don't you think you deserve more than just settling? His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was I settling? The thought had crossed my mind before, but I'd always pushed it aside, buried it deep where it couldn't hurt me. Now, Lucas was dragging it into the light, and I wasn't sure I could face it. Before I could respond, the sound of the front door opening broke the tension. Julian's voice echoed through the house, calling out for me. My heart leaped into my throat, panic surging through me. Go, I whispered urgently to Lucas, my eyes darting toward the doorway. Please, just go. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching mine. Then, with a slow nod, he turned and slipped out the back door just as Julian stepped into the kitchen. Hey, honey, Julian said, his warm smile instantly calming my frayed nerves. He set down a bag of groceries and walked over to me, pulling me into a hug. I let myself melt into his embrace, the familiar scent of him grounding me. Hi, I murmured, my voice muffled against his chest. I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a reminder of the life we'd built together. Was I really willing to risk all of this? You okay? Julian asked, pulling back to look at me. His brown eyes were filled with concern, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took my breath away.
Yeah, I've fine, Ilid, forcing a smile.
Just tired. He nodded, seeming to accept my answer. How about I make us some dinner tonight? You've been working so hard lately. That sounds nice, I said, though my mind was still reeling from the confrontation with Lucas. I watched as Julian moved around the kitchen, his movements easy and unhurried. He was always so steady, so reliable. Was that enough for me? As I set the table, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen, my stomach tightening when I saw Lucas's name. My fingers trembled as I unlocked the phone and read the message. You can't ignore this forever. Meet me tomorrow.
We need to talk.
I quickly deleted the message, my heart racing. Julian glanced over at me, his brow furrowed. Everything okay? Yeah, just a spam text, I said, tucking my phone back into my pocket. I avoided his gaze, afraid he'd see the guilt written all over my face. Dinner was quiet, the weight of my secret pressing down on me. Julian chatted about work, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside me. I nodded along, barely hearing his words as I picked at my food. Later that night, as I lay in bed next to Julian, I stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Lucas's words echoed in my mind, taunting me.
Him or me?
The question seemed impossible, and yet I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the cafe where Lucas had asked me to meet him. My hands were clenched at my sides, my stomach in knots. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. He was already there, sitting at a table in the corner. His eyes met mine as I approached, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through me. I slid into the seat across from him, my heart pounding. You came, he said, a small smile playing on his lips. I did, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the cup of coffee in front of me. Look at me, Ava, he said, his tone commanding. I lifted my eyes to his, and I was immediately drawn in by the intensity of his gaze. You can't keep running from this, he said, his voice soft but firm. We both know what this is. You just have to decide if you're brave enough to admit it. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I don't know if I can, Lucas. I don't know if I'm strong enough. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. You're stronger than you think. You just have to trust yourself. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. The kiss was soft, tentative, but it ignited something deep inside me. I felt myself leaning into it, my resistance crumbling. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my heart racing. Lucas's eyes were dark with desire, and I knew I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't come back from. So, what's it going to be, Ava? He asked, his voice low and urgent. Are you going to keep pretending, or are you going to finally live? Do you think I did the right thing?